Welcome to the Forest Industry Lecture Series. This is the 76th lectures that sort of Department of Renewable Resources is organizing. So we have a very great speaker. Thanks for coming here, Paul. Before I start the program, and I would like to start recognizing our donors. We have a list of people that basically make this day possible from our own side. Now I would like to start reading the list one by one, and then we can start to invite our speaker. On the top of the list we have Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, Alberta Forest Products Association, Alberta Innovates Biosolutions, Alberta Newsprint Company, Alberta Pacific Forest Industries Inc., Altus Geomatics, CAM4, Canadian Institute of Forestry, Rocky Mountain Section, College of Alberta Professional Foresters, and College of Alberta Professional Forest Technologists. That's one of the reasons that we have this joint meeting together today. Con E. Dormat Environment and Forestry Service, DLA Piper Canada LLP, Earth Econ, FRI Research, Forcop Solutions Inc., Forest Soil Science Limited, FB Innovations Foreign Tech, FY Forest Limited, Greenlink Forestry Inc., Horseshoe Creek Consulting H2C Limited, Incremental Forest Technologies Limited, Miller Western Forest Products Limited, MNP LLP, Nature Resources Canada, Division of Canadian Forest Service, Northern Forestry Center, Nicol Environmental Solutions Inc., Norbont Inc., Philip Robert Enterprises Limited, PVC Canada, Silvacom Limited, Tolco Industries Limited, Wonderwell Contractors 1971 Limited, West Fraser Mills Limited, Warehouser Edmonton, Woodland Operations Learning Foundations. I would like to invite, let's everyone give a big round of applause for our supporters. So this is a really big event. We organize two times every year, and I would like to invite our new Department Chair, Dr. Helen McDonald, to say something about the event.
Thank you, Nadir. Welcome to the 76th presentation in the Forest Industry Lecture Series. It's amazing to see such a great turnout. We want to express our thanks to Alberta Association of Forest Management Professionals for allowing us to tag team the Phil's lecture with your technical session. This has provided an excellent opportunity for us to reach out to a broader audience and to connect with such a large group of practicing forestry professionals in Alberta. So thanks very much for this opportunity to pair these events. As the new chair of the Department of Renewable Resources, I'm amazingly proud to be leading the group that we represent. We have an astonishing group of faculty, staff, and students who work very hard and are the foundation of a bright future for forest science and management in Alberta. We greatly value our connections to our partners, to practicing professionals in government and industry and consulting in the province, and it's events like this that allow us to build those relationships. So we greatly value your attendance here and the opportunity that this event provides for us to come together and share our ideas and share exciting new innovations about forest management in Alberta, and to meet one another and connect and solidify our relationships. And so I hope you'll take advantage of that, and we really appreciate your attendance and the opportunity that this event provides for us. I would like to invite my predecessor as chair, Vic Liefers, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, it's nice to see so many familiar faces and friends. And it's a great opportunity for us to get together on events like this. And so that brings me to the introduction of the speaker, Paul Yankee. Paul is a principal of the Forest Economic Analysis Advisors Company that provides services, premier services for forest products in the North American market. The company that he represents is hired frequently by provincial governments in Western Canada and across Canada, as well as across the United States. His professional passion is the analysis and forecasting of lumber markets and their roles, and he's become a top economic analyst in this area. He produces a regular publication that documents the trends in the North American lumber markets. Paul co-authored many studies on international lumber, timber, bioenergy, engineered wood products, panel industries, and he's presented many of these topics at international conferences. Prior to joining the Forest Economic Advisors Group, he was a senior vice president in the wood products and timber section of RISI, which also is another large economics analysis company in the United States. Before this, Paul was a research economist at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, Sweden, where he was an econometrics modeler. In discussions that I had with Paul yesterday, I found out that he also is an avid hockey player, and he's a great hockey fan. So he shares a lot of values with Canadians besides love for timber. He holds a master's degree in economics from Boston University and a bachelor's degree in economics and German from the University of Connecticut. He's no stranger to Alberta. He's been here to speak at AFPA meetings in the past, and he's a frequent advisor to the government in Alberta. And I'm really delighted, actually, that we could bring him here to share his knowledge with our students and our professors who try to get us out of the ivory tower, and it's a great opportunity for him to speak to such a large mass of audience of forestry professionals that are in this room. So please join me in welcoming Paul Yankee to give the address of the 76th Phil's lecture. And the title of his talk is Demographics and Technology Improve Lumber's Prospects. So please welcome Paul.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to come back here and speak to you and get a chance to get to Canada again. I love it here. It's one of my favorite places. And as long as I'm thanking you since I'm in Canada, I should also thank you for all the Stanley Cups that you repeatedly send down to the U.S. We appreciate that as well. You're polite, yes, thank you. That's why you keep sending them to us. But as people have rightly pointed out to us, that all of our players are Canadian, so I guess we do have that. I'm from Boston, actually, so I really can't be talking too much hockey right now. It's a terrible time to be a Boston fan. So when I came here, I gave a presentation not too long ago at the Alberta at the FPA meeting. And I had an hour and I had 70 slides, so it was obviously way too many slides for the time frame that I had. So when I got here today, I ran into a couple of people at that meeting and they were, you're not going to do 70 slides again, are you? And no, I don't have 70 slides. I have 120. So I'll try to, luckily for me, there's a lot of them that are actually pictures. I read at about a third grade level, so I like to have a lot of pictures in there. It makes it a lot easier for me. And I'm actually kind of reminded, this goes back a long way, but for some of you guys who are older, you'll remember a politician in the US by the name of Phil Gramm. And I kind of feel like he does when he's describing his gun collection. So he said that he has more guns than he needs, but not as many as he wants. And that's pretty much how I feel about my slides. So I would actually like to have more than 120. But with that, the quick and dirty, because I know that I probably have your attention span for about 5 minutes. So what I'm going to cover is I am going to actually go over where we see these markets going in the near term. So in particular, for the first, I'm going to break this down over the next 5 years, where we see these markets going, where we see lumber markets going. And then I'm going to talk about it a little longer run. And the longer run picture is actually fairly interesting for a number of reasons. One is there's changing demographics that I don't think a lot of people recognize and a lot of people don't pay attention to. In fact, if I'm not going to do it because I don't know if there's a lot of people here, but if I ask people, what do you think the sort of underlying demand for housing is in the U.S., the sort of long run trend, the underlying levels of lumber consumption that we would see, a lot of people actually think we're getting pretty close to that level right now. But the reality is we're really, really far away. We're really pretty close to what would typically have been a recession level in terms of our markets. So I think there's actually, from a demographic side, there's a lot of interesting and exciting things coming forward. And then I'll spend a good bit more time talking about some changes in technology that could potentially increase the amount of lumber that's being used in North America. So we have a pretty wide range of people in the audience, I imagine. Some people with a lot of experience, people with more experience than me in this industry. I was going to say I see some people with less hair than me, but that's not actually possible, so I don't think that's the case. But more experience, we'll leave it at that. And then other people with not a lot of experience. So I'm going to try to cover a broad range and give a bit of a background to some of my slides as well. And that's what I'm going to start with. I was actually speaking at the university earlier today, and I was talking about the lumber, the softwood lumber agreement in '96, and I jokingly said, "Oh, you guys weren't born then," and it turns out they were, but they had been born the year before that. So, so there's. I'm going to actually cover a little bit of history as well. So to begin with, this is lumber consumption in North America. It's the blue is the U.S. and the red is Canada. And I think that the thing to point out here is just that huge drop that occurred between 2005 and 2009. So we went from 76 billion board feet of lumber being consumed in a year down to a little over 40 billion board feet. So that was an incredible, almost 50% drop in lumber consumption. So it was obviously very, very devastating to the industry. And then after that, we kind of moved sideways for 3 years. You can see that through 2011, there's almost no growth. And then since 2011, we've slowly come back. It's been a slow, painful process. And even now, 2015, 2016, we're only back up to about 50 billion board feet in consumption. So quite a bit lower than where we were at the peaks. And even if you think 2001 was a recession, so that was a bad year for housing. And we were still over 60 billion board feet of total North American domestic consumption. So we're still well below even recession levels. So why, I'm going to get a little bit, in order to talk about why we've had such a slow recovery and where we see these things going forward, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail in what really drove that decline. And what this graph shows is it just shows the percentage of lumber that's consumed in each of the end-use markets. So we break it out into, well, we'll break it out into more, but we aggregate some for the purposes of this slide. And so essentially it's new residential construction, which is the blue. It's repair and remodeling markets, so additions, alterations, that sort of thing, which is the yellow. Industrial markets in red, and then non-res in gray. And non-res is actually an interesting area. I don't actually talk about it because I have 120 slides already, so I don't have time to. But I'll just point out that there's been a lot of work done by the Softwood Lumber Board to increase consumption in the non-res markets, and it's actually been quite effective to the tune of about 1.6 billion board feet more production, or more demand coming out of that sector. So that is one area that's growing, but again, fairly small market, so not a lot of time. I left it out of this presentation. But the thing to really notice in this is that big decline in the percentage of lumber that's going into the new residential construction markets. So historically, it's been about 40%. And if I took this back to 1990 or 1980 or 1970, you would see that it kind of cycles around 40 to 45%. But it's dropped in the recession. It dropped, the percentage of lumber going into the residential markets dropped to 20% with that huge decline in new home starts. So as these markets, as those housing markets come back, they're really going to be the driver for new consumption as they move back towards more normal levels or more historic levels. And because of that, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about housing markets in the US. So right here, this shows the actual housing starts, and you can see, and we peaked in 2005, 2006 around 2 million units and collapsed by about 75% to a little over 500,000, so about 600,000 units in 2010. And then again, this really mirrors the consumption graph, and that we had moved sideways and then slowly move up. So, why did we see this big collapse? Well, and the reason why I'm going to get into why we saw this big collapse is it kind of gives you some ideas about how we're going to get out of it. And it's a long story, but that story starts with lending, with mortgages. And if we look at the mortgage rates, this on the left-hand side, it shows the 30-year mortgage rate in the U.S., and on the right-hand side, it shows what your monthly payment would be on a $200,000 loan. And what we saw was that starting in 2000, mortgage rates were around 8.5%, and that translated into about $1,700 to $1,800 a month in payments. And those rates came down to a little over 5%, and with that, your monthly payment on that same $200,000 loan came down to around about $1,200 to $1,300. So there was a big drop in the monthly payment. In other words, it made it those falling interest rates made it more affordable for more people to get into the markets. If you look at home prices over the same period of time, this is both new and existing home prices, average home prices, you can see that they skyrocketed. So if you're going with the new homes, you're going from somewhere around 170,000 up to about 260,000 at their peak. And then for new homes, a little lower, around 130, 140,000 up to over 225,000. So we had a big run up in prices that coincided with it becoming more and more affordable to purchase a home. And because of that, these low interest rates and the rising home prices, people wanted to get in because of the rising home prices, and they could get in because of the lower interest rates. So that drove up demand for new homes. And what this shows new home sales. So new home sales went from more historic levels of around 1 million units up to about 1.3, 1.4 million units on this is all seasonally adjusted annual rate. So we had a big increase in the demand for homes as measured by those sales. And of course, you have a lot of sales, a lot of demand. So what do contractors do? Well, they do what we always do well. They overreact and they overproduce. So those green lines show you the underlying demand. That shows you roughly, if we go over a 10-year period, roughly what they would need to build. And then the red line shows what they've actually built, what they built over this period. And you can see that they were building well more than the underlying demand. So we were borrowing demand from the future, if you will. We spent up a lot of that excess demand. So in other words, households that might not have been able to perform because of affordability conditions, because with low falling interest rates, they could afford to actually go out and buy a home, as long as they maintain their job. But the problem is the economy started to slow. And you can see that in that sort of 2004, 2005 period when we were at the peak, our economy was growing at about 4%, 3.5%, 4% on an annualized rate. And then as we get out into 2007, 2008, it dropped, and we actually saw some pretty solid negative, so contraction in the economy. And with that, employment plunged. So these are big numbers, but these are 130. Of course, I don't have the scale on there, but these are thousands of employees. So we went from 100. So at its peak of around 138 million jobs. So employment is non-farm payroll employment. We lost about 8 million jobs, a little over 8 million jobs, down to about 130 million. So that was a huge loss in jobs, and those people then didn't have the ability to pay back their mortgage. And because of that, we saw a big drop in household formation. So typically we would expect about 1.2 million households being formed every year. But during this time, as the economy started to slow and as people started to lose jobs, we saw the household formations drop to less than half of what we would typically expect to see. So with that job loss and the lower household formations, this is that same slide that I'd shown earlier with the home sales, but I've actually these are both new and existing home sales, and you can see that big plunge going from somewhere around 8 million units of sales every year to under 4 million units. So there's a huge decline in the sales of homes. So you had people losing their jobs, so they wanted to sell their homes, and they needed to sell their homes, and then you had a big decline in demand for those homes. And what does that mean? Well, they lost their jobs and they couldn't sell their homes because no one wanted to buy them. So we saw a big spike in foreclosures. So these are actual foreclosure filings on a month-to-month basis in thousands. So you can see that we went from 60, 70,000 foreclosure filings in any given month, up to 350,000. So a huge increase in foreclosures. And that caused the mortgage companies to go, to run into trouble. It caused the big banks to run into trouble, and we kind of all know the story from there. So with and then this slide actually shows the month supply of homes for sale, which is a good measure of the excess inventory that we have. So this is you can see that you go from 4 or 5 months at historical averages up to almost a full year's month supply. So there was a huge excess of homes for sale. And when you have that excess of homes for sale, you don't need to build any new homes to house your growing population because you have homes that are vacant, just sitting there. So housing starts since then have recovered modestly. Where do we go from there? Well, obviously, the key to this, if the driving factors that cause these markets to decline were the loss of jobs and the issues in the mortgage markets, then settling those issues are, getting the income growth coming back and getting the jobs coming back. That's really key to improving these markets going forward and getting back to more normal levels. All right, I had a timer set, but I can't see it, so you're going to have to let me know when I'm running out of time. So to begin with, for a lot of people, they mention how housing is, we're kind of getting close to what a lot of people think of as normal and where we're going to be long-run trend going forward, but I would argue that that's probably not the case, and part of that argument is a historical argument, which isn't always the best type of argument to make, but it certainly feeds in some. And so what we did here, the bars are actual housing starts going back to the 1920s, and then the line is the starts per 1,000 people, because obviously you have a lot fewer people, hundreds of millions fewer people back in the 20s than you have today. And so you can't really compare then to now unless you do it adjusted for population. So that's the line. And the thing that you see with this graph is that, yes, we've had some recovery, but we're still very, very low in terms of our housing starts, both in terms of absolute numbers and even more importantly, in terms of as a percentage of the population. We really are down near still down near Great Depression and World War II levels. So given our population, there's certainly room for growth if you just look at this from a historic basis. We don't obviously want to just look at this as a historic basis because you could have structural changes that are going to force that to happen. And I can answer those in questions, but we would argue that that's actually not the case. A lot of people will point to things like changing desires, living, changing in the household structure, kids living at home longer, getting married later, not wanting to separate out, changes in driving patterns, not having kids, all sorts of factors people point towards. But I think there's another factor involved, which is the demographics and where the most of the population is, or the large chunks of the population are right now, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we don't. That's a long way of saying that we don't think that there's been a structural shift. So in terms of going forward, why would we expect continued improvement? Well, this shows the change in payroll employment. So these are millions of jobs, and you can see in the U.S. we're adding 2 million plus jobs per year. So we're adding a lot of jobs. And right now, the rule of thumb historically, sort of back of the envelope type calculation, is that there's roughly, for every 2 jobs you add, you need a household. So, these 2 to 2.5 million jobs that we're adding, that's translating into 1 to 1.2 million new households. And by definition, if you have a new household, you need a housing unit to house them, so you either go take a unit from vacant stock or you build a new one. So people say, well, jobs are coming back, but there's not a lot of wage pressure. Wages are not growing, and they point to that red line right there, which is the main indicator. I'm an economist, so like most economists, I can pick and choose any series that I want to prove my point. It's why if you get two economists in a room, you'll have three opinions about what's going to happen. So that red line is the one that most people point to, but the issue with that red line is that's the average hourly earnings from the BLS. That is all jobs. So that includes the older folks who are leaving the workforce and the younger folks who are coming in. Well, what happens when the older folks leave the workforce is obviously they're at the end of their careers, so they're higher paid, and the younger folks coming in are at the beginning of their careers, sorry guys, so they're lower paid. So, and that's just how it is. So that statistics get skewed by that change in the workforce composition. So the blue line, which is the Atlanta Fed does a wage tracker, that's actually same job. So that's for the same job. They're looking at the same jobs over and over, and how are those jobs, how are wages going in those areas? And that, you can see, we actually see a little bit stronger growth. So that's positive. Housing affordability, this is simply, this is a NARS measure, the National Association of Realtors, and then we do the forecast on this, but this is their measure of housing affordability, and that value of 100 means that a family with a median income can exactly afford a median-priced home. The green line going across there shows the average from 1990 to 2005, and then the dotted red line is our forecast going out through 2018. And so you can see that even going forward with interest rates rising and home prices rising, we still have the affordability is still quite high in the US. I mentioned that if you're going to form a new household, you need a new housing unit, and that either comes from building a new home or taking a unit out of the vacant stock. Well, it's one thing in the 2007 to 2011 period, 12 period, where you have a lot of vacant stock out there. That's that sort of 12-month supply of vacant units. But now we're back to more historic levels. So we're back to that 4 to 5 month supply. So as a new housing unit is formed, they need to build a new home to house that new unit. And we're seeing this in the single-family home sales numbers. So this shows you single-family homes, and there's lots of things. I can point to all sorts of different statistics that show this tells you what should be happening, and that tells you what should be happening, and I'll do that throughout the course of my presentation. But if there's one statistic that you look at to try to figure out where the housing markets in the US and therefore the lumber markets and ultimately the timber markets are going to be going, it's this new single-family home sales number. And the reason that's important is because that is an indicator for demand for new homes. If you're not selling them, nobody wants them. If you're selling a lot of them, people want them. So that's really the key indicator there. And you can see that's really pushed up over 600,000. Actually, the average of the past 3 months is a little under 600,000, but still it's pushed up to around 600,000. And what does that mean in terms of housing starts? Remember, I had talked about our peaks were up around 2 to 2.2 million units started. The troughs were around 550 to 560,000. And a home sales of about 600,000 translate into new demand for housing and starts of around 1.25 million. So that's the rate that we're running at about right now. And the trend on that home sales has been going up. So we would expect to see that the demand for housing to continue to go up, and housing starts we needed to continue to increase from there. So just a little bit of background on that slide, because I know I threw a bunch of numbers, but one question you might have is, well, if you have sales of 600,000, why do you need to build 1.2 or 1.25 million homes? It's because not every home that's started is sold. A bunch of homes are built for the homeowner. So, and these sales are only single-family homes. So with some of the homes that are built are actually multifamily homes. So that's how you go from 600,000, and we map that up to about 1.25 million. So that's the good news. Good news, bad news. I'm a forecaster. I tell you what's going to happen. So I usually say things are going to go up and things are going to go down, and not necessarily in that order. But it makes me very valuable as an economist. So I just told you about things going up. So now I'm going to tell you about things going down. But I think that the key here is this living in an age of diminished expectations. So yes, we do think things are going to be better, but we think the growth rate is going to be slow. And this idea that we're living in an age of diminished expectations, I think, is captured nowhere better than by this slide. Yeah, this one and the next one, actually. what this slide shows, it takes a little bit of explanation, but the lines on this slide are the IMF's forecast for GDP growth around the world. And then each year they do a new forecast, a 5-year forecast for global growth. And then that blue area is actual world GDP growth. And so a couple of things to notice. One, the IMF has done a terrible job in forecasting. Go economists. Can I do it? I know the AFPA guys are gonna kill me, but there's a lot of you guys who haven't heard this. My dad actually built wooden boats for a living. That's what he did. And he worked at a place called Mystic Seaport, which is an old whaling museum. And so, there a lot of crazy folks would come in there and, look at the old ships. And one time he had an old sailor, an old mariner came in, and he came in, he was talking to my dad. My dad was building an old whaling ship, or was repairing an old whaling ship. And he started talking to him, and the mariner said, this reminds me of a story. I was on a ship one time and I got stranded in an island in the South Pacific, an island of cannibals. So he walked out into the island and he was walking around and he came upon a butcher shop. And thank you, you're laughing already. So it makes me feel good. So he came upon a butcher shop, and outside there was a sign. And the sign said, doctor's brains, $10 a pound. Oh, sorry, $10 a kilogram. Professor's brains, $12 a kilogram. Economist's brains, $20 a kilogram. He's like, wow. So he goes inside and he said, yeah, economist's brains, $20 a kilogram. They must be really valuable. And the butcher looked at him and said, are you kidding me? Do you know how many economists I have to kill to get a kilogram worth of brains? I said, yeah, well, lawyers were $30 a pound, just saying. Anyhow, so yes, so that you can see the interesting thing here, and why we say we're living in an age of diminished expectations, you can see each year those revisions down and how they're going lower and lower each year with those forecasts. And then if we look at, so the other thing to notice is that if we go back 5 years ago, the general consensus for the world, for world economic growth was that it was going to be about 4.5%. Whereas today, it's a little over 3.5%. Well, it's about 4%. 3.5%, 4%. All right, sorry guys. There are 3 types of economists: those who can count and those who can't. Apparently. So if we look at this just for the U.S., same picture just for the U.S., and you can see, again, the IMF has done a pretty bad job, as have all professional forecasters have done a pretty bad job of predicting where these markets are going relative to where they were. And then you can also see the big revision down. So economic growth, we're living in an age of diminished expectations. Economic growth is going to be slower than we thought it was going to be 5 years ago. And there's a number of reasons for this, and one of the prime ones is productivity. So productivity is the output per worker per hour, and that was growing at around, if we go back to the beginning of the last decade, that was growing at about 3.5% per year. And it's now trended down to about 0.5% per year. So as an economist, we would say that growth in overall GDP is a combination of productivity growth and population growth. So if your population growth is growing 1% and your productivity is growing 0.5%, you're going to have economic growth of 1.5% over the long run. So this is really a major concern. And what does this mean? Well, this puts a damper on incomes. If you're not producing more, if you're only producing 5 or 0.5% more each year for every hour that you work, your boss can't give you a raise, or if your raise is going to be pretty small. So wages, this is going to hold down wages. Another issue is we've actually seen incomes grow fairly substantially, but the question is, how are those incomes distributed in the U.S.? And I guess the short answer is obviously not well. So I'm sure you guys have been paying attention to there's a little election going on down there. And so in any case, depending on the story that you want to tell, you can look at mean household incomes, that's the blue line, and say, you know what? Incomes today are 20% higher on average than they were back in 2000. And a lot of people do look at that and say things have done really well. But the reality is, if we look at median, which is half the people are below and half the people are above. Oh, you guys are Canadian, you already know that, sorry. I'm usually speaking in the US, so I have to explain that. But, sorry to the Warehouser guys. anyhow, so the median actually is just back to where they were. So essentially over the past 15, 16 years, incomes haven't grown at all for the median household. It's part of the reason why Trump is getting so much support in the U.S. Because people aren't doing well. Obviously he's focusing it on the wrong. He's got the wrong culprit and the wrong solutions, but he's not wrong about the symptoms of the problem. So we like to say he's the wrong person at the right time. Well, actually, I'm from the Northeast, so I can say that, but if I were from the South, I'd say, damn straight, he's the right person. So my mom's from Florida, and she's been a lifelong Republican, and I called her up and I said, if you vote for Trump, I'm not bringing the grandkids down to see you for another 3 or 4 years. So I told my daughter, and she said, yeah, that's fine, I don't want to see her if she votes for Trump anyhow. She's 17 years old, so it could go both ways, actually. Again, no offense. So economic growth is a combination of a bunch of different things. One is, so economists have lots of different ways of looking at things, and so one way is looking at productivity and labor force growth, another way is looking at the various components, and one of those components is government spending. In the U.S., it makes up between 15 and 20% of GDP, and the problem is that there's really little scope in the U.S. for increased fiscal stimulus to the economy, and not just in the U.S. It's really around the globe as well. And so what this graph shows is the government debt to GDP ratio, and you can see in the U.S. we're up around 110%. Our debt's about 110% of our GDP. So you're running into limits in terms of how much more you can spend. The only country that's really doing well on this is Germany, and that's because I think they're stealing it all from Greece. So another area of growth for the economy is business investment. And you can see that businesses just haven't been investing all that much. I don't have a lot of time, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see, over the past year, so the past 4 quarters, average investment is actually negative over the past 4 quarters. So not a lot of business investment going on. Come on, did I not? Oh, yes, so that was business investment and government spending. And actually the very first one was consumption, and I didn't actually mention that as part of the GDP, but consumption is really the driver behind the US economy. It makes up 65 to 70% of the overall economy, and we all know that as an American, as I get $1,000 of extra income, I go out and spend $1,500 of it. So this is, that wage growth being slow is something that really can hamper overall economic activity. So those covers the major areas of the economy. So it's not just that economic growth is going to be slow. There's also a bunch of supply side constraints, and one of these supply side constraints will filter through into what I have to talk about later on in the day. But if we look just at labor, the cost of labor and the availability of labor, and the cost and availability of land. This comes from a survey that the National Association of Home Builders does, and they ask their members, what are your biggest concerns? And you can see that, going back to 2011, labor and land, both the cost and availability of that labor and land, is a huge concern for these people. They're having trouble finding the laborers, and when they get them, it's at a much higher cost. They're having trouble getting land to put houses on, and when they do, it comes at a much higher cost because of all the regulations that are associated with building a new home today. So these are some real shortages, supply side constraints to seeing a rapid increase in housing starts. And this, now to get into specifics on the labor side, this is actually a really interesting chart, and the sort of volatile line there is the unemployment rate in the construction sector, and the red line, the more consistent line, is actual employment there. And the thing to notice is that the unemployment rate in the construction sector is actually quite low. We're back to historic levels, and yet the actual employment rate has not recovered in the same way that the unemployment rate has gone down. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that we're having there's a shortage of workers out there. And historically, one of the groups that have filled that void in the construction industry have been immigrants, and Mexican immigrants in particular. But going forward, even if the U.S. economy recovers, there are some real structural constraints to the immigration, at least from Mexico. Not to mention the fact that they probably don't want to come anymore. We also have real structural constraints in terms of, if we just look at the population, and you can see that the declining population of folks aged 15 to 34 in Mexico. So there's just simply not going to be as many workers, and the job prospects in Mexico are better, so they're going to want to stay there. And this is just another way of looking at it, but this goes back to 1980 and shows the fertility rate in Mexico, and you can see that coming down from 5.5 children per woman down to 2 roughly at this point, a little bit over that. So that doesn't bode well for labor force growth going forward, at least not through immigration. And of course, the U.S. is like other countries. We don't have other developed countries in Europe where we don't have the native growth in our population to meet our, we have slow native growth in population, so we do need to have immigration in order to bolster that GDP. Another issue is the availability to get a loan. It's great that interest rates, I refinanced my mortgage for 3.5% for 30 years. It's crazy that someone's willing to give me that kind of money. So I went out and took a second mortgage because I figured it's close to free. And I wonder why we had a problem in 2008. So this shows you the average FICO score. And the red line is the weighted average FICO score of all loans that are given, which is around, so at this point the weighted average is around 750, and the median FICO score is about 700. So in other words, there's a big chunk of the population who's not able to get a loan. The blue bars, if you stack them together, that's the percentage of the loans, of single-family loans that go to people with credit scores under 700, which is, again, median. And you can see that that's right around 15%. So for half of the population, they're only getting 15% of the loans. So that's an indication that credit scores are credit rationing is alive and well, and it's difficult to get credit. But it's not just the homeowners trying to get loans who are facing tight credit conditions. This graph comes from the Senior Loan Officer Survey that the Fed puts out, and it's a measure of the percentage of banks that are tightening versus loosening their lending standards. So a negative number means they're loosening their lending standards, which they were doing. The banks were loosening their lending standards to home builders. But over the past year, they've actually been tightening it. So it's getting more and more difficult for home builders to get access to cash, which means they can't, if they don't have the access to the cash, they can't build homes on speculation. So a gradual U.S. housing recovery is still the most likely scenario when we put all these things together. What we expect over the next 5 years is for housing starts to increase by 80 to 100,000 units per year. So the economy's improving. There's a bunch of pent up demand, which I'll talk about in a second. I haven't talked about that yet, but the economy's improving, jobs are increasing, wages are going up. That's all good news. There's a bunch of supply side constraints, and the economy's going to grow slowly. That's the bad news. So instead of seeing a big jump of 150 to 300,000, we're going to see slow, steady increases over the next 5 years, which over time add up so that we get back up above 1.5 million units for housing starts. So new residential construction makes up about 40 to 45% of the demand for lumber. Another 30%, and actually lately it's been a lot higher than that. It's actually been flipped up to the 40 to 45%, but historically it's 30% of the demand for lumber goes into residential improvements. So additions, alterations, improvements, that sort of thing. And so this just shows you our forecast, history and forecast for residential improvements. And you can see the trend line is the green, and you can see that we do expect improvements to improve, but not to quite get back to their trend levels. And there's several reasons for that. One is that the housing stock in the U.S. is getting older. So this shows you the median age of the housing stock, and if we go back 2 decades, it was about the average home in the U.S. was about 27 years old. They're now about 37 years old. So those homes that were built back then were around 2,000 square feet, whereas today we're building homes that are closer to 3,000 square feet. So when somebody buys a home, an older home, they want to improve it, add an addition, alter it, make it bigger, and so that's going to certainly bode well for our R&R industry. And it's all good and well if you buy a small home and you want to add on to it, but you need the money to do it. So one of the ways that we do that in the U.S. is we borrow. And what this graph shows is it shows you the owner's equity in real estate. So, and it shows that the homeowner equity has gone back up close to previous peaks, which means that they have money to tap into in their homes, so they can tap into that money and use it to improve them. So that's certainly a good sign as well. So when we put all this together, what we expect to see is consumption in the US going up, moving up over the next 5 years, and going from a little over 50 billion board feet last year to a little over 60 billion board feet by 2020. So we're gonna add 20% to our consumption. We're gonna add a little over 10 billion board feet. So it's not fast, it's not a lot, but it's certainly, and we don't get back to our previous peaks, but it's certainly good. Longer run, we're actually quite optimistic, and this has to do with the demographics for the most part, pent-up demand and demographics. And what is that? Well, the green line, this is an earlier chart that I showed, but I extended it out. The green line shows underlying demand. That's the amount of housing that we need to build over a long period of time to house our our growing population. So every year the US adds 3 million adults to their population, and those adults need to live somewhere. Either they need to live in their own home, or they need to live in their parents' basement, or with non-related people. So as these adults as these kids become adults, as we have immigration, we need to house these people somewhere. And what's been happening, we haven't been building homes, so what's been happening is they've been doubling up. And there's been a big increase in the doubling up that's going on. So that's pent-up demand, because you're not gonna live in your parents' basement forever, right? I mean, at some point, you're gonna get to be 35 or 40 years old, and you're gonna wanna move out. Maybe a little bit sooner. So you can see it right here, actually. So this is the percentage of adults, 25 to 34, who are living at home. And so historically, you can see it's averaged a little over 11%. And now we're up around 15%. So if we look at this relative to the actual size of that age group, that's about 1.5 million households that have not been formed. And these guys, it's pent-up demand going forward. So that's a positive factor going forward. We've also seen a change, and this is a structural change in the economy. So we have simply fewer people living with either spouses or unmarried partners. And so as a percentage of the population, people living with a spouse has gone from 70 to about 50%. People living with unmarried partners have gone from a little, basically zero, a little over that, up to about 7-8%. So that's made up some of the loss in the married partners. And we've seen some increase in all others, which is living with non-related people, among other things. But one of the other things that have gone up is the number of people living alone. And the math is really simple. If you have 2 people per household, you need 1 housing unit for every 2 people. If you have 1 person per household, you need a housing unit per person. So you need twice the number of households if you have 1 person per household you need twice the number of housing units if you have 1 person per household relative to if you have 2 per household. So that increase in the living alone, that structural increase in the living alone, will increase demand for housing. And so these next 3 slides are the key slides, and you guys saw these earlier today, but if there's one point that I want you to take home from today, it would be these next 3 slides. So for those of you guys who've started to space out, start paying attention again. They're gonna take a little bit of description, but what this graph shows is it shows what we call the headship rate. It's the number of households per person. And to give it a little bit, just put some numbers on it and give you an example. If you have a headship rate of 0.5, that means you have 2 people per household. If you have a headship rate of 0.25, that means you have 4 people per household. So if you have 100 people in your society and you have a headship rate of 0.5, that's 2 people per household, you need 50 housing units to house those, the 2 people per household. If you have a headship rate of 0.25, you only need 25 housing units to house all those people. So the thing to notice in this graph, and this is data that goes back to 1960, and we actually have data that goes back to 1940, and it shows the same thing. The real big thing to notice here is the jump in headship rates. So the fewer people that you have per household when you go from under 25 up to 35 and 45. So that's the big thing to notice. So if I ask you guys today, what's the single biggest age bracket, what's the single biggest age year in the US, meaning that has the largest number of people, what would you say? You guys would probably say, it's the baby boom, right? It's baby boom generations, definitely. Everyone always talks about that. That's the biggest age group. But the reality is the peak age groups in the US are 25 and 26 years old today. And I know this comes as a surprise to a lot of people, that's actually where most of the people are, but that's where they are. So they are today in this, they're at the end of that low headship rate group and starting to move into the higher headship rate group. And if we forecast this out over the next, to the end of this decade, the two biggest age groups, 5-year age brackets in the US, are that 25 to 29 and 30 to 34-year age bracket. So we've got a large chunk of population that is moving into age brackets with higher headship rates. And this just simply makes sense, right? You're under 25, you're in college, you're just out of college, you have a bunch of roommates, you're living in a multifamily house. You get to your late 20s, early 30s, you decide to settle down with a partner, and when you're living with a partner, you probably don't want your college roommates hanging out with you every night, so you kick them out. And that's exactly what happens. So it not only does it fit with the data and the numbers that we've seen historically, but it also makes intuitive sense to us and hopefully to you as well. So what we see going forward is that changing demographics and the improving economy is going to bolster housing starts and push those housing starts back up to cycle around 1.5 million units. So we are going to have years where housing starts go to 1.7, 1.8. I mean, we wouldn't be at all surprised to see housing starts go to 2 million units. We're not forecasting it right now because we do need to make money, and you guys would laugh at us if we said that. But we wouldn't be at all surprised to see it push up towards that 2 million units. So that's very, very good for our industry. And it filters all the way through, to the timber and the timber landowners, so the provinces as well. Another issue is the single-family share. We use about 3 times more lumber in single-family homes than we use in multifamily homes. And you hear a lot of people talk about how we've seen these structural shifts that folks no longer want to live in single-family homes. The suburbs are dead. Everyone's moving into the cities, which actually is absolutely false. And the data actually shows that people are moving to the suburbs, but that's a different topic. But that's one of the things they point to. They point towards green living, wanting smaller homes, not wanting to drive, all of that. To the single-family share having dropped in the past decade or so. And they say going forward, this is a structural shift, and we're going to continue to see that drop. And we've seen lots of forecasts that show that red line continuing to drop down to around 50 to 55%. But we say no, that's not the cause of this. We say the cause is simple demographics. If you look at where the population is today, where is it? They're 20 to 25. I mean, they're that sort of 19, 18, if going back 10 years, 18 to 26, 27 years old. And where do you want to live when you're 25 years old? Do you want to live in that nice suburban house with a white picket fence in the yard? No, of course not, right? You want to live in the city. You want to live in, with your friends in a multifamily type unit. So the shift towards more demand for multifamily is a cyclical shift, meaning it has to do with the population, where the population peaks are, and it's not a structural shift. People haven't changed how they want to live. And if you go back to housing starts, and I think I have right here, yeah, so if you go back to when the baby boom generation entered adulthood, you see the exact same phenomena. Actually, that's not the right place to see it. You can see it in this chart right here. The single family share was very low as the baby boom generation entered adulthood, because of course they all wanted to live with their friends and their buddies in the multifamily housing. They didn't want the single family housing. So if we look at this longer run, we do expect to see lumber consumption moving back up towards its previous peaks, not getting there, but moving back towards there. So the long run story is actually quite positive for our industry. And at this point, you guys are probably sick of hearing me talk, and I have no idea how much time I have left. But I do want to, I'm halfway through my presentation, and I think, except I can't figure, I'm 3/4 of the way through my presentation. And so you're going to see, it's going to go really fast. But I think this is, to some extent, this is some of the more interesting things, but there are a lot of pictures, so I can actually go pretty quickly. So one of the questions that I have is, there's the traditional markets for lumber, but also, are there any new markets for lumber? And one of the things that's really of a lot of interest and gained a lot of attention lately is something called CLT, or we like to refer to as consumes lots of timber. Other people know of it as cross-laminated timber, but we like to consume lots of timber. And the real question is, does it? Does it consume a lot of timber? Yeah, sure, for every panel you make, it consumes a lot of timber. So yes, it uses, if you're gonna build a house out of it, it uses 2 to 3 times more wood per square foot than a traditional stick-built home. But how many homes, so in other words, if you wanna know, has it really moved the needle, how many homes are actually being built out of CLT? What has it done to total volumes? And certainly, there's been a lot of press about this. Everyone talks about CLT. In fact, there was a conference in Portland in March of this year, and they put CLT on, it was the Mass Timber Conference, and they had almost 500 people show up for it. So it was a huge conference. Our conference wasn't about CLT, and we had 90 people. So you guys are welcome to come. So the real question is it a game changer? So for the construction industry, the potential answer to that is yes. It's a game changer in terms of how you build your homes. But what about demand for lumber and ultimately timber? You know, is it, see, I told you I can go fast. Is it moving the needle? Well, let's look at where CLT is being consumed around the globe. You can see that, you know, 3/4 of it almost is being consumed in Europe. So most of the CLT that's being consumed today is being consumed in Europe, with a smaller percentage in North America and the rest being in other countries. CLT consumption, total production, 600 million cubic meters, 500 million cubic meters of consumption, which is roughly, you know, 300 to 400 million board feet of lumber. So are these big numbers? Reminds me of my wife. So 100 million cubic meters is what we, is the total European sawn timber production. 500,000, I'm sorry, yeah. So 500,000 cubic meters is the sawn timber that's consumed in CLT. So I think that pretty much clearly states that that it is not a game changer. It has not been a game changer so far. And it's, oh, look at that, after 20 years. So sure, fine. It's not very big, but hasn't it been increasing? Haven't we seen really strong growth? Well, if we look at it, you know, from 2011 to today, yes, in percentage terms, it's really strong growth. I mean, we've gone up 25% in the past 5 years, but in absolute terms, it's still quite small. And then, yeah, that was just for Europe. For the rest of the world, I can't even do that math in my head. That's a lot of growth. But again, you're starting from a very small number. So, why is it difficult to adopt CLT? The main reason is that if we're looking at this from a construction perspective, most of the projects are one-offs. So there's no replicable process for building homes out of CLT. And there are no code limits right now, or these codes don't exist. So you often have to get architects and engineers in to design these buildings, and they lack the experience to do that. So there's not a lot of them out there. There's very little manufacturing capability. So even if you had demand for it, it'd be tough to get the product. And I kind of mentioned this already, but the projects require special code approval, and so every single project has to go through the architectural process and the getting the architect to design it and getting the approval. So it just takes a lot of work. So, you know, without a breakthrough, we actually just did a big study on CLT and all engineered lumber products around the globe, and this comes from there. So without some sort of change, we really don't see a mass increase in CLT for traditional usage. So the architectural CLT consumption, we don't see it growing very much. It's about 62 million board feet. Is there anything that can change that? And this gets into the potentially new and exciting changes. And this all stems from the UK. So this is I'll give you, I guess, a business case example of the UK, where we have an affordable housing crisis. So they're building about half the homes that they need. And not only are they building about half the homes that they need, but the home prices are extremely expensive. So that blue line is the US, and for me, homes in the US are really expensive, but then the yellow line is you guys, and that's even more ridiculous. I mean, try to buy a home in Vancouver. I was talking, I know that one of the managing directors of Raymond James, and he was talking about how he bought a teardown for $2 million in Vancouver. So, you know, that's the Canadian number, and then you look at the UK and it's even worse. So obviously very difficult to afford a home there. And estimates are that they need about 1 million new rental homes by 2021 just to just to house their population. And one problem, similar to what we're seeing in the US, is there's really a big shortage of labor to build those homes. So a company called LNG, they've come up with a solution, which is their modular homes, and they're building the homes for rent. Not all of them, actually. They're going to be selling some of them, but a portion of the homes they're going to build for rent. They're going to do it with CLT shells. So the next few slides, well, probably not the next one, but at some point here I'm going to hit a bunch of slides that show pictures of the process. One issue, though, is that modular home construction has been around for a really long time. So what's different this time around? Well, for LNG in particular, it's a scale and financial backing issue. LNG is a huge company, over $1 trillion in assets. They've committed over $500 million to this process, so they're planning on building a number of plants. So they have the scale and the financial backing to make this work. Another process when you're building modular homes is that you still need the skilled labor on site to build it. So they wanted to de-skill and deframe the process so you don't need the skilled labor anymore. With the labor constraints that we're seeing across the developed world, it's a more important issue. And then this idea of vertical integration, that you're actually building to rent instead of building to sell. And so if you own the land and you own the building and you're just trying to rent the property, it's much easier to make this work than if you're actually, and you have the capital behind it, which LNG with their $1 trillion does. It makes it much easier to do than if you're trying to build these homes to then rent them. And then there's all sorts of versatility with CLT, which you'll see in a minute. But going from building single-family homes all the way up to high-rise apartments. So in terms of scale, the plant, it actually opened about a month ago. So this plant is actually in existence in building homes right now, and they're obviously not up. They just started, so they're not up to full peak. But when they get to capacity, they'll be producing about 4,000 homes per year, and they have the capacity to double. They have the space to double the capacity within the facilities, so that they can actually produce about 7,500 homes per year. Let's get them all going down. So anyhow, they've earmarked, it's 500 million pounds, not $500 million, which is quite a bit of dollars. To build an additional 7 plants. So if you look at that at full capacity, it's somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 new homes per year in those plants, depending on how many lines they put in each plant. If they do this, they're going to be the largest home builder in the UK and the largest consumer of CLT in the world. So if we're looking at the plants, and this, I'm not going to go through this because I don't have a lot of time, but if you're looking at this from a government perspective, each plant's going to employ about 400 people, which is fantastic. You're going to pump out homes that are affordable for people, so you can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, which is what they're looking at, is getting these housing units for members of their society, and also employing people. So in terms of disruptive technologies, they've de-skilled the process. So in order to build these homes, they don't need framers, they don't need electricians, they don't need plumbers, no drywallers, plasterers, carpenters, carpet layers. It's all done mechanically. It's all done in a factory. So you do need these people when you're putting the home together, but you need far fewer. So you don't have the issues that you have with a declining skilled labor force. Also deframing the process, so it's essentially there's no need for any of the products, the LVL, PSL, LSL, glulam, any of these products as well. So you're replacing that with CLT, which uses more lumber. So then the vertical integration component, they're not only going to build the homes, but they're going to buy them and rent them out as well. So they don't need to sell these homes; they just need to rent them out. And their plan has them making about 3.5% on their money, which for them, is pretty good. They're pretty happy with that return. And then there's all sorts of opportunities as well in terms of versatility. So you can go with single family, multifamily, you can go to apartments up to 20 stories. And we all know the story of the student housing in BC, the large building that they just built. Many, many stories. So there's lots of opportunities for building with CLT. So this really could be a game changer. In terms of if they build out all seven factories, you're looking at about 500 million board feet of lumber being consumed, roughly 2 million cubic meters of logs. And that's just in the UK, which is a fairly small market. And I will tell you that they're looking to expand around the globe. They actually have a partnership in place in Seattle, and they're working on another one in New Zealand. So this is something that they're trying to take around the globe. And it's not just in theory, they've actually got their first plant up and running. Of course, they still have to prove that it can work before this takes off. I think that was the last question. So what's the process? Real quick, it starts with a CLT plant. So there's actually a CLT plant within that facility. You manufacture the plates. Then you have a CNC cutting machine that cuts in the doors and the windows. And so you have your walls, doors and windows in them. And then the first station, you build the box, you put the whole thing together. And then you paint it. I have no idea why you paint it before you do everything else, but hey, that's what they said. You install the electronics. So all the electrical outlets and the electrical wires and everything get installed in the box. You install the plumbing. You put in the windows and exterior doors. All of this is done mechanically inside of a factory. So you have no skilled labor doing this. You install the joinery, kitchen, bathroom. You add the final decorations. I told you I could go fast. You put in the floor finishes, the tile and the carpeting, the wood floors. And then you go through the inspection process, commission it, you ship it to your site, and then you stack all the boxes together, and you can stack them any way you want, up, down, up, side to side, and you can they say that you can, a lot of flexibility in customizing these homes. And then you have your home, which is ready to rent. And here are some pictures of the finished home. So these are nice high-end home, well, they're for rent, so I guess they're not high-end, but they have the potential to build nice high-end homes as well. This just shows you some of the things. So potential other breakthroughs. Another area actually for CLT manufacturers, there's 7 of them in North America, is access mats. And it's actually quite a big market that CLT has very little share of. And again, this is just a bunch of pictures. So I can show you some of these access mats and some of the different ways of using them. And you guys actually are probably well aware of these because you have big need for them in the oil field. But for pipeline mats, I guess there's a pipeline that might be going down through North Dakota that they're talking about, but depends on who gets elected. Crane mats, transmission line mats, barge mats for barges. There's a large number of uses for these access mats. We actually know of a company that just doubled its production because demand for access mats is increasing. So for going across wetlands, each of these projects can consume a large amount, so 6.5 million board feet of lumber. So these are large consumers of lumber. And if we look at the overall market, it's about 1.4 billion board feet, and right now CLT only has about a 3% share of that, so they can increase that share. So as I mentioned, the demand is growing pretty quickly, 10 to 15% per year. And it's a combination of growth in industry and also pressure from environmental groups to protect the ground. So if we look at the non-LNG type, non-modular home construction, it really is that industrial demand for CLT that's going to grow over the forecast. We're not really looking for that much growth in architectural demand because it's too difficult to rapidly increase CLT consumption in homes. They're going to be one-off projects that occur slowly over time. And most importantly, if we're looking for ways to increase the amount of lumber and the amount of fiber that's consumed in North America, is that if Trump gets elected, we're going to need to build a wall to prevent all the Americans from coming up to Canada. So you guys are going to need to build a wall. And I hear that wall is going to be made out of wood. So with that, thank you very much. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them now. So thank you, I appreciate it. Anyone but Ziggy, because I heard he was going to ask a question about the softwood lumber issue. Can't have that.
Paul, I have a question.
Yes.
I know Nadir, if you can just
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it.
You look at demographics,
Mhm.
but I'm not a forester and I'm not a statistician or an economist. You talk a lot about jobs, but everything I hear about the job market for young people is so many of them can only find part-time jobs, a number of part-time jobs, so they're not in a position to be home. Do you look at those demographics or the demographics of our aging population selling their homes when they are moving into retirement?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to repeat the question because I know a lot of you guys couldn't hear this. She was asking me, someone at my advanced age, how can I maintain my good looks and my fine physique? Was that pretty much, oh no, okay, sorry. So she was, so the question was, we look a lot at demographics. So it's actually two parts to the question. We look a lot at demographics and, you know, that the population's growing and that jobs are coming back, but what you hear a lot about in the news is the fact that it's part-time work, it's low-skilled work, it's not a lot of, you know, it's not high-paying. And unfortunately, this isn't my computer, so I can't pull it up, but I have a slide, which I did not include, which shows employment starting at the recession for both part-time and full-time workers. And I'll just kind of draw this for you, a mental picture. The recession occurred, and part-time employment goes up 2 million units, right? So for about 2 years. Full-time employment drops, and again, I don't know the exact number, but it's about 4.5 million, I believe. Actually, it's even more than that. It's 8 million. Full-time employment drops. So you have part-time employment going up, full-time employment going down. This is the first 2 years. And then part-time employment starts moving sideways at the end of the recession, and full-time employment has slowly come back. And we are today at a point where full-time employment is back up above where it was prior to the recession. So we've made up for all those jobs. So the reason why you hear all the stories in the newspaper about how all the jobs are part-time is because it sells newspapers. It's much more interesting, and no one wants to talk about the fact that we do actually have these jobs coming back. That's part of it, but the other issue is that yes, our full-time employment is back to where it was 10 years ago or 8 years ago, but unfortunately we have 24 million more people. So that's certainly an issue there, is that there are still a bunch of people who are underemployed or out of the workforce. The nice part about this is we actually are losing while we're adding more young adults and young folks to the workforce, we're actually losing a bunch of old folks as well who are retiring. So the second question was, what about housing units as older folks retire and move away? And I guess I would say that, again, does anybody know what the average age of the baby boom generation is? It's probably a lot lower than most people think. So it's in their late 50s right now. I think it's 58 last year, I want to say. But it might have been 2 years ago. I'm starting to get old and hard to remember. But this is 58, 59 is the average age. So when are these people going to, when are they going to want to downsize and sell out? You're looking at, you know, best case scenario, because we're not, like, in the US, we used to be able to retire at 65, but now it's 68, and by the time I get there, it's going to be 75. No, it's pushing up into the, you know, the retirement age is getting later and later. So we're looking at least 10 years before a lot of these people retire and want to downsize and sell their home. And the funny thing about it is that, I know it's anecdotal, but there's a lot of evidence, actually about 50% of the people, there's been a bunch of surveys, and I actually have these charts. I'm happy to give them to people if they want them. I just don't have them on this presentation. I thought 120 I thought was enough. But if you look at it, about 50% of near retirees say they do not want to downsize. So they either want to upsize or they want to maintain the same size of their home. So it's not as dramatic and as drastic as a lot of people think. And I mean, just again, anecdotally, one of the kids that I grew up with in my hometown, his parents retired, and they went from a 2,500 square foot home to, he was quite successful, so he went to a 7,000 square foot home on the golf course, and without any kids. So I'm not sure what he's doing with all that space. Maybe his wife wants to stay away from him. I know that's my case. So, all right. So any other questions? Yes, we have a question back here, and I think there's one over there too. But I can repeat too. So home sizes in the U.S. have shockingly just gone up and up and up and up, and it's like everybody lives in Texas, where, I don't know if you guys know Texas, but everything is done big in Texas. So so home sizes were at 2,200 square feet, 2,400 square feet, and then the recession hit and they dropped to 2,200 square feet or so. And then as we kind of pulled out of the recession, they've actually gone up to 2,700 square feet. And part of that is simply a result of the types of homes that are getting, well, there's two issues on that. One's the type of home. We had far fewer spec homes getting built, so you're building them for the owner. So on average, your home size has gone up because, I'm a guy who's building my own home. I'm not building a 2,200 square foot home. I'm building a 5,000 square foot home, right? So part of it's the type of home that's getting built. So that's part of the reason. That was part of what drove up those home sizes. But as we look going forward, so as we switch away from these spec-built homes, as the economy starts to come back, we actually expect that to come down a little bit, and so the home sizes to come down. But long run, we have data that goes back to the 1940s. As incomes go up in the U.S., home sizes go up. And quite frankly, an average home size of 20, even 2,700 square feet is at least for U.S. homes, is fairly small. And if you're in the Northeast, which have traditionally had larger homes than in the South, people are moving from the Northeast down to the South as they retire, so they're actually demanding larger and larger homes in the South. So we're seeing larger and larger homes getting built in the South. So I would say that in our forecast has home sizes dipping as we get to more spec-built homes, and then trending back up again with economic activity as the incomes grow. And it's just going to happen at a slower rate. But eventually, if you go 2 decades from now, the average home is going to be 3,000 square feet. We like big homes, big cars, all that stuff. Big hats. You guys like big hats too, right? Alberta, yeah, cowboy hats. So I'm not sure that I heard, but did you say that you've heard that there's a trend towards smaller homes? Okay. So this comes back to a demographic issue, which is to the extent that there's a trend towards smaller homes, there is a trend towards more multifamily building. So I'm going to take a step back for a second. If you've heard that there's a trend towards smaller single-family homes, then you're probably listening to Trump because it's you're getting your information from the wrong source and the person's wrong. But if you're referring to the overall home sizes, there has been a shift towards, so if you're looking at square footage, so you multiply the average size of the multifamily home times the number of multifamily homes built, and then the average size of the single family times the number of single family homes getting built, and you add those two together so you get the total square footage getting built, that has trended down because of a shift towards multifamily, but not the overall home sizes. The overall single family home sizes are actually up. I mean, we're not, I don't know if this past quarter we're at record levels, but 2 quarters ago I think it was 2 quarters ago we were at record levels. So the single family home sizes are a lot bigger, but it's that shift towards the multifamily. And we would argue that shift is more cyclical than structural, meaning that with the rise in the early 20s, the population group in the early 20s, they desire multifamily homes more than if they were in their mid 30s. And I think it makes intuitive sense, and it also fits with the statistics and the data that we've seen. So yeah. Any other questions? So the average lifespan of a home in the U.S. is about 60 years. And so what you see is those homes being demolished, and on average, we demolish about 300,000 homes per year. I mean, obviously we haven't been doing that in the past decade because we're only building, for 3 years there we were only building 600,000. But yeah, you get a bunch of demolitions, but just as importantly, you get additions, alterations, and improvements on the homes. So that's why that additions and alterations, that's why that improvement number or the residential repair and remodeling becomes so important. And especially as the houses age, because those older houses are a lot smaller. So we need to people want to replace those with bigger. And we are a very small company. Actually, we're 12 people. And 2 of our 12 are adding big additions onto their homes right now. So, I mean, this is, I know that that's purely anecdotal, but it's going on across the U.S. It's very difficult to get a contractor in the U.S. right now. There's a lot of activity. Yes?
Well, someone has to ask, next week, America becomes great again. What's going to happen to you?
Nothing. No, we're, America becomes great again. I thought we were always great, damn it. Damn it, we were always great. I was at I gave a talk in Australia 2 months ago, and the guy came up after. He said, "I got a present for you." It was me, and I came from the furthest away, and the guy second furthest away was from Russia. And he comes up and says, "I have the 2 people who are the furthest away," and he walks up and says, "I've got presents for you guys," and he pulled out a Trump hat and a Hillary hat, and he said, "Okay." So the fact that I'm still here tells you which hat I got, because my wife wouldn't let me back in the house. So one of the nice things about the U.S. is that the government is there's big portions of the government that actually don't want to get stuff done. So there's a lot of gridlock, and no matter who becomes president, there's not a lot that they're going to get done, especially initially. I think it's going to be very difficult if Trump gets elected. It's going to be difficult for him to fulfill some of the crazy promises that he's made. Some of the things, it's like some of the treaties and stuff like that. He's not going to be able to just simply pull out of those. I think that there's going to be a lot of advisors who are arguing against that. And I think what the American people are going to see is that he's not a lot of what he's been promising and say he's going to do. He's not actually going to be able to do it. So so we don't really expect a big difference in terms of productivity growth, in terms of labor force growth, depending on who's elected. So the problem is that Hillary's been pushed towards more conservative stances on immigration, on trade policies, because of Trump, and quite frankly because of a misunderstanding of why the U.S. economy is growing slowly, and the politicians really perpetuating that and encouraging that thought. But we don't like to think about that quite yet. So we'll wait till Tuesday. Someday? Is that what you're telling me? Yeah, it might. Yeah. What's that? November 8th. Wait a minute. I don't know. All right. Yeah, I'm not sure. A softwood lumber dispute? Is that? All right. No cameras. No. I can obviously. So what do we think? So we have all sorts of opinions on this, and I have all sorts of information on it. But essentially, it can pretty much be summed up with this one particular slide, which is that there are multiple different outcomes that can occur. There can be a negotiated settlement, an agreement, sort of a softwood lumber agreement, or SLA, if you will, which are the second two, or there can be litigation. And so what we do is we look at the various possibilities and then assign a probability to each of those things occurring. So the U.S. side wants a quota system. They want to have an agreement with Canada with a quota system. And Canada would prefer something more similar to the past agreement, which has trigger prices that institute taxes, and then adjust that with an exchange rate. So we assign a pretty low 40% probability to actually coming to an agreement. There's too much political pressure in the U.S. To not give in and to not budge. And quite frankly, that sort of 22 to 25% that the U.S. has offered is quite low relative to historical Canadian market share. So I think that Canadians don't want to give in to that at all, and particularly the BC producers don't want to give in to that, and they're willing to go to the mat. The U.S. side feels really strongly that the U.S. ITC and ITA will agree with them. and impose duties on Canadian lumber imports. And in that political environment, they're probably not wrong. So because of that, we assign a pretty low probability to an agreement getting reached. And so that's about 40% of some agreement where we think there's, we think there's a higher probability of the quota system because the U.S. is going to insist on that and they're willing to go to the mat and they don't mind getting the litigation because it simply benefits them. So we think there's a higher probability of that occurring. And then that leaves the litigation path. And the litigation path, we assign about a 60% probability of that occurring. And the U.S. wants everyone to think that there's going to be a 30% duty. And so we assign a pretty high probability of that being the case for a number of reasons. Whether or not you think it's right, the ITC and the ITA are going to, well, in this case it's the ITA because they're assigning the duties. There's going to be a lot of political pressure for them to assign a high duty. And so we do think that that's, whether or not you believe that you're actually getting subsidized at a 30% rate or dumping at a combined dumping and subsidy at 30%, I think that there's a lot of political pressure to do that. And the other option is to actually do cross-border comparisons or in-country comparisons where you would probably find something closer to a 5 to 15% in the same way that after the initial round of 30% in the SLA, in the 2001 findings, they got slowly ratcheted back to that sort of 10, 11% range. You'd probably see something in that range if we do the cross-border or in-country comparisons. And that would assume that the ITA is not bowing to political pressure. It's not just bowing to political pressures, but not sort of getting pushed by the U.S. side to have a higher rate. And so we assign a much lower probability of that happening. So most likely 30% duties, then having some sort of agreement, and then on a very low likelihood, you'll see lower rates. If I have it, which I doubt I do, no, I didn't bring it. So what does this mean for the industry? Actually, it's actually not a bad thing for the industry, these trade disputes. I have a slide where I show lumber prices when we have trade disputes versus lumber prices when we have a negotiated trade agreement. And lumber prices are higher and more volatile when you have a trade dispute because for the obvious reasons that people don't know what's going to happen next. So they don't know what's going to happen next month, next quarter, and so you get panic buying and then not panic selling, but panic lack of buying. And so you see a lot of volatility, and it tends to drive prices up as well. So, and then the beauty of it so far is that you have these duties that are imposed, and ultimately you get the industry gets it back. You don't necessarily get all of it back, but you have higher prices while the dispute's in place, and then you'll get it back at the end of that once you reach an agreement, or at least that's what we've seen historically. So, all right, I'm hoping I'm not getting myself in too much trouble. Yes. Yeah, so domestic demand and supply in North America versus Canadian demand and supply, a tariff, and how that all will pay out is the question. And just so you know, this isn't even half of our slides on the demand side. We have far more slides on this on the demand side, and then we have twice as many on the supply side. So we have tons and tons of slides on the supply side, but we just simply don't have the time. I don't have the time today to go into it, but so we do have a lot of information on the supply side. And so in a nutshell, demand in North America is going to grow faster than the U.S.'s ability to supply that demand. So we are going to need Canadian lumber in the U.S. to supply that demand. The problem in Canada is that you have your real supply side constraints in terms of the mountain pine beetle in BC, limiting the ability of BC to increase their production. And then in Eastern Canada, and I know we won't consider Alberta to be Eastern Canada, but in Eastern Canada and sort of Quebec and Ontario, you have not so much, you have some supply side constraints in terms of lower AACs than last time around, but in addition to that, you have residual constraints, if you will, and that is that producing lumber, you produce lumber in Quebec in order to produce, you actually are producing chips for your pulp mill, and then lumber is the byproduct that you sell on the market. So as demand for newsprint goes down, then the demand for the chips goes down, so you just simply don't need to produce as much lumber. And the problem comes in that you need to get rid of those chips somehow, and if you can't sell them to a pulp mill, you really have no other place to sell them. I mean, there's lots of ideas. I know that FP Innovations is a sponsor here, and they're looking at things like turning it into insulation, wood into insulation, and there's lots of research, bioenergy, that sort of thing, in ways that you can use it. But the value of those chips relative to the pulp mill is about 1/5. So that's going to dramatically increase the costs, which will be good for everybody else, and in particular good for you guys, because if it's more expensive to produce lumber in Eastern Canada, and there's demand for that lumber, that's just going to drive up the price, because the prices are set by the marginal cost producer, which Eastern Canada is right now. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate you taking the time to listen.